just wanted to say hi to Victor and to explain to him about the questions, and that's it.
Perfect. And I will mute and turn off my video too later, so we will be just in background together. I will just show you, let me just find it here. I will show you a couple of reminds. We have time, so let me just open here, and I will, if I can, I will share the, or I can just read it. So, oops, wait, here.
All right. Hello, everybody, from wherever you are. This is Francesco Verso from Italy, Rome, and I'm going to have a little speech about the FutureCon. FutureCon is a special kind of convention, a place where everybody from each country and culture is in the center of a global conversation. We believe that the future happens everywhere, from Beijing to Mumbai, from Moscow to Istanbul, from Rome to Lagos, from Rio de Janeiro to Los Angeles. And for this reason, we have been working for 3 months to introduce to you some of the best authors of science fiction from more than 20 countries. Some panels will be driven by geography, covering all continents. Some others will be theme-oriented, dealing with some of the most relevant issues of contemporary science fiction. And others will be focusing on translation and editing inclusive books, with a special event on Saturday that will celebrate many science fiction awards across the whole planet. I want to thank all the amazing people behind the scenes that with their work, passion, and enthusiasm have brought us here. Ana Ruscia, Fabio Fernandes, Renan Bernardo, Gianna Bianchi, Tiago Lee, and Bruno Müller. I feel very lucky to have met you, and you did a great job. But hey, now comes the hard part. All panels that you are about to watch will be accessible on YouTube for free, forever. This is our gift to the worldwide community of science fiction during these troubled times we all live in. And in fact, we believe that we should not go back to normal, because we want to see some changes. We want to prove to ourselves that with imagination, inclusivity, and technology, we can become richer and stronger. So we would like to introduce some anti-fragility in the system, meaning that we will gain from shocks like the coronavirus that kept us divided and isolated. Even though we live in different countries, speak different languages, believe in different things, we want to share a common future. A future based on innovations, visions, and traditions that come from the widest possible sources of literary biodiversity. To preserve the future, especially in this moment of dangers represented by climate emergency, fake news, and science deniers, we should preserve ourselves, care for our interconnected present, listen to the genius loci, that spirit which represents the interaction of place and identity, and embrace a multicultural diversity that can keep us together. One last thing. Please consider that the majority of the panelists at the FutureCon speak English as their second or third language. So, if we will do mistakes, forgive us. We are trying to make our best. So now it's time to let the FutureCon begin. I leave you to the first panel, What the Future is Taking Place in India, Pakistan, and Philippines. And the moderator is Victor Ocampo. Up to you.
Thank you, Francesco, for that wonderful introduction. Good evening and mabuhay, everyone. It's 8 p.m. here in Singapore, in Manila, and in Beijing. And I am here with a powerhouse cast of South Asian writers. And let's see, do I introduce you by the script or do I introduce you by how you come out in my Zoom chat? Maybe I will start with Anil. Anil Menon is an writer, and he is also a PhD in one of the most interesting parts of computer science. Anil, would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah. It's a long time ago, but so I did my thesis work in something called evolutionary computation. And the idea is basically to use ideas from what we know of evolution and apply it to computer programming. And I was working on some, so that those algorithms are difficult to understand. So I was working on some mathematical models for figuring out, analyzing these programs. That's evolutionary computation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Indrapramit Das, or Indra, is actually a writer whose work I very much admire. I first saw it when I was reading your Clarion output a long time ago, actually.
Thank you.
Let me allow you to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Indra, or Indro. I'm in Kolkata. It's 5:30 here. And I'm a writer and an editor of various genres. I don't think I have anything much more to say about myself. We can get to the others.
Okay. Lavanya Lakshminarayan, did I get that right?
You got that right.
Is an author and a game writer. Something that I'm just getting into myself as well. Can you introduce yourself?
First of all, very cool that you're getting into game writing. And yeah, so I'm from Bangalore, India. It is around 5:30 in the evening here. I just published my first book. It's called Analog Virtual. I'm also a game writer. And if you were ever spammed by Farmville, that was me, and I'm really sorry.
Last but not the least, we have Bram Stoker Award-winning Usman T. Malik from Pakistan. Usman?
Hi and assalamu alaikum, everyone. I don't think any of us can go really after Anil's evolutionary computation. The rest of us are really, I mean, I have a very boring and very mundane job. I'm a physician in my daytime life, and I'm a part-time writer in my nighttime life. And I have a book, it's a collection of stories called Midnight Doorways, Fables from Pakistan. And Indra and Anil were both kind enough to read advanced reviews, good review copies.
Yeah,
and,
lovely book.
It's wonderful, yeah.
Because this is the first panel, so we are prone to making mistakes. And my mistake was I didn't introduce myself. So here's a one-line thing. My name is Victor Ocampo, and I am actually a Filipino speculative fiction writer. I'm based out of Singapore. That said, before we start, I actually have a few business reminders from people. If you have any questions, please follow our YouTube channel, and you can actually add your questions to the YouTube chat that's over there. You can also go to our website, FutureConSF.com, where you can see schedules for all the panels and also all the technical issues that you may have joining our chat. So, well, we're all here because we want to talk about how we view the future from our part of the world. Everybody knows the Western side of things with all the movies that we have. But what does the future look like from South Asia? What does the future look like from Southeast Asia? And that's why we've all come together to this panel to discuss. And what I will do is, actually, I am a replacement moderator. The original moderator was SB Divya. And so shout out to you, because I will steal all the questions that you actually put together in this panel, and that is what we will go through. I hope we will have time for me to be able to add mine, but essentially your questions are so good that I feel it is a crime if I do not actually use them. So without further ado, I would like to actually start off with the first question that Divya put. We are in the West, science fiction has become pretty much a mainstream, something that's mainstream. Do you see that happening where you are? I mean, on Netflix, I see a lot of new Indian science fiction, speculative fiction shows, but on the ground, what is it that you see? Maybe we start alphabetically, like I did earlier. So Anil, what are you seeing from where you are?
I don't think people make a clear distinction between speculative fiction and science fiction, for example. Mm-hmm. And when they think of science fiction, they generally mean robots and aliens and so on. It's straightforward derivation of the Asimovian version of science fiction. In that sense, it is not mainstream. It is a curiosity. I think it's considered fun. It's considered something that it's good for children, for example, to teach them science. Dystopian fiction is becoming something of a focus. By and large, I do not think the reading public is all that aware of the people working in this field. The names that drive their attention are driven mainly from the Booker Award lists and the mainstream English literature. On the other hand, there is not the typecasting that you find in the West. So authors are free to work in different genres. You can publish a book in spec fic, you can publish a book in climate fiction, you can go publish a book in regular establishment fiction. So from the publishing side, they don't make a distinction. And from the readership side, the awareness, I don't think, has crept in yet. But it's you can see signs that is going to happen. That is, it's happening and it's going to happen increasingly. That's how I see it. In other words, it's a good time to be a spec fic writer.
Thank you. Indra?
Going off what Anil just said, I don't think that there's it's certainly not at the level that you see in the rest of the world with science fiction and fantasy becoming completely mainstream now. The majority of popular culture is dominated by speculative fiction now. In India, as you were saying, Netflix India has released a few things, but they usually there isn't any science fiction that I can remember exactly, but there's a few fantasy or they are going into genre. I don't think they're having a tremendous amount of success, but none of those shows have really gathered any kind of major following or critical acclaim. So they're kind of floundering there. I think they want to break in to the Indian market, but again, as Anil mentioned, I don't think there's much. We do have a science fiction readership in India. We definitely do, but many of them kind of focus on the white male canon. Asimov, Clarke. When you go to Indian science fiction groups, which have become more common now because of the internet, there's tons of Facebook groups, and they're often dominated by recommendations for Asimov, Clarke, etc. But I do think that access to science fiction by Indian authors is increasing. The awareness of that is increasing with more South Asian writers write this genre. For Vandana Singh and Anil have been working in this field for a long time now, and so when they started working, people barely even knew about science fiction magazines and stuff like that. But now I think as people want to write it, people also want to read it more. And so I do think that magazines like Strange Horizons, etc., have done a lot to increase that exposure. But mainstream, it's definitely not mainstream. Now, our publishing industry doesn't focus on genre fiction as a thing, really, because it's much more. I don't think fiction itself is very popular in India and the Indian publishing industry. So that when we publish fiction, it's almost entirely in the realist space, or definitely not genre fiction, other than mythological fantasy, which is extremely popular here. Obviously, you must have heard of that. Just based on the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, there's lots of those retellings. But yeah, just other kind of stuff, it usually isn't marketed as science fiction and fantasy.
Lavanya, how about yourself? Also, specifically, if you could add something coming from that part of genre fiction that intersects with gaming.
Well, I do think these are, definitely subcultural in India. I mean, there's a tiny little group that like both, and they're kind of quite committed to these spaces. But like Indra was saying, I think mainstream fiction, literary fiction is really what people in India read by and large when it does come to fiction. I think most people tend to prefer nonfiction. Having said that, I think with the advent of YA and sort of greater inclusivity in YA science fiction and fantasy, own voices writers, I've actually seen a ton of Indian readers who are, in their late teens, early 20s, who are reading these YA writers. So I'm quite optimistic that, that will act as like a springboard for them to kind of discover the wider gamut of science fiction and what it has to offer, particularly homegrown science fiction. And, when you look at these subcultural groups, they are reading Indian writers. I've had discussions with them on your work, Indra, or on your work, Anil, right? Like they're looking through magazines, accessing Strange Horizons, accessing Mithila Review. So I'm optimistic that while it hasn't arrived yet, we're kind of on the cusp of seeing a movement towards appreciating science fiction and fantasy here.
Thank you so much, Lavanya. Usman, I want to add something to the question when you take this. I know that you were instrumental in putting up the first essentially spec-fic workshop in Pakistan. And as you answer this question, can you also add us how you can bring awareness to science fiction work where you are, particularly to the local science fiction that is being produced by people in your part of the world?
So thank you very much for the question. When I stepped into science fiction back in 2012, 2013, I came sort of as an outsider because my background, my interest was actually in horror fiction and dark fiction. So I never thought of myself as a SF or fantasy writer at all. I grew up reading a little bit of Asimov, maybe a little bit of Clarke, but Bradbury maybe, So science, like, core canon science fiction, what they call canon science fiction, was not where I came from. So when I started reading and writing, I found a huge world of riches, and that's what drew me deeper and deeper till I guess I became a science fiction writer. So in Pakistan, and interestingly, that sort of actually mirrors the journey of a lot of Pakistani science fiction writers. A lot of them come from fantasy backgrounds, and maybe the reason for that is Pakistan really doesn't have a hard, quote unquote, hard science fiction tradition. We just don't. And I think part of the reason may be that Urdu has never really developed a common vocabulary for science fiction. So in the dominant language in Pakistan, Urdu, I have never read a good hardcore science fiction story, maybe a few here and there, but nothing that would say, okay, this is, this is like a milestone true science fiction story. So in Pakistan, anytime we talk about science fiction, really we're talking more about spec fic as a dominant part of that science fiction umbrella. We did a workshop on spec fic in 2014, and we actually had a really good response. So we had about 12 students. And interestingly, what I discovered over the last 6 years was it was through those 12 people that slowly a small, at least the social media dominant science fiction fan group developed from those 12 people. And then other people who were interested started gravitating towards that space. And in 2016, we started the Salam Award for Imaginative Fiction, which is for writers of Pakistani origin. And since then, there's actually been quite a bit of an explosion. So we have about maybe 10, 12 new science fiction writers, and now they're publishing. They are, they're reading, they're doing workshops. So it has really grown in the last decade. I think maybe that answers your question about what one could do to, bring awareness and create a locus to which people move. Workshops, panels, doing this. Doing something like this and putting word out there about it, I think is a big thing. But I can promise you even now, most people in Pakistan, diehard readers, even science fiction fans, don't know about this because they just don't have access to it. There's no real space in Pakistan where people will hear about this. There's no science fiction grapevine.
Just very quickly, from my part of the world, I live in Singapore, but I come from the Philippines, and the two have actually very different ways of, different histories when it comes to speculative fiction and science fiction. Singapore being a very high-tech country is also a very new country. Science fiction quickly took root. Sometime in the early 2000s, it just blossomed. And I believe, Indra, you've been here to Singapore Writers Festival one time. I think the very environment where you are makes people want to write about it. And there's been a small but flourishing science fiction a movement here. The Philippines is the exact opposite. It was under Spanish rule for 400 years, and then Americans for 50 years. And for some reason, realism had such a hold that genre fiction really did not have much of a chance to flourish, except probably in the last five to 10 years or so, with the introduction of one publication that suddenly opened it up. And what is sad about that particular thing is, at least for Southeast Asia, the Philippines has the oldest tradition of science fiction. The first science fiction book was written in 1946, Dr. Satan by Mateo Cruz. After that, nothing happened, and it's very sad. Originally, Philippine science fiction, which is basically the core of speculative fiction here, was written in Filipino, which is, the standardized national language of the Philippines. And I wanted to ask each of you, do you see that kind of writing in the indigenous languages, or your? I remember, Anil, I will throw this question and then we go around. That in the 70s, there were a few science fiction stories that were written in Tamil periodicals. I think then somebody in the audience mentioned a name which I haven't read, Sujata. Are they still doing science fiction in any of the Indian languages?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, I think the classic example is Bengali. It was in Bengal that, including West Bengal and East Bengal, that the British were most predominant. And so here were a group of people who were suddenly faced with technologies and a race. They met the aliens, basically. And that kind of triggered a re-examination of every aspect of their lives, including literature. And some of the earliest works, in fact, the earliest work in English by a South Asian author, that today we would call an Indian author. It's in, I think, 1835, and it's by a young student called Kailash Chandra Dutt. And it's an classic example of political near future fiction. He anticipated a time 100 years from his era in which the British would no longer be ruling India. And he was absolutely correct. I think it was off by a couple of years. So there were a lot of fictions that came out in the early 19th century and the latter part of 19th century that were written in Bengali. There were some stories in Malayalam, there were stories in Tamil, in Marathi, and so on. And there are these periods in which attention fades. The people move on to other things. For example, realism made a big comeback because of the feeling that too much of Indian literature is focused on fantasy, that they're not talking about the real problems of people. So there was a move away from fantasy and anything that involved the imagination to something like, let's really talk about the real problems. And anything that kind of smacked of making up was frowned upon. But again, in the 60s and 70s, there are flourishing communities in Marathi, again, Calcutta, in Bengal. I know in Tamil, it appears in these small magazines. Sujata Rangarajan is one of he's called the Tamil Asimov. He's written more than 70 novels. He never stopped writing. He used to put his novels, advertisements for his novels into movies. So he was very, very active. So there is this flourishing tradition. It tends to be slightly derivative in the sense that they're influenced by the classic golden age of SF is so strong that they rarely step outside it. You get a kind of Vedic science fiction in which you take ideas from the Vedic times and you say that actually there was great technology, right? So you kind of reinterpret the past in scientific terms. There are these moves, these gestures. But the short answer is, yes, there is a tradition. I would say it's flourishing, and there have been works that are, let's say, remarkable. For example, the Virgin Fish of Babu Ghat, I think, by Lokachandra Bhattacharya, which is a sort of Brave New World written in Bengali. So there are these works. but they're scattered and they're not often classified as science fiction. They're classified as magic realism or stuff like that. So you do find that it kind of diffuse spread. It's only in recent times that people have begun marketing themselves as spec writers. I hope that's not too long an answer for you.
No worries. Indra, thank you, Anil. Indra, I want to add something to the question for you. As a writer in the diaspora, do you see any Indian writers actually writing in their own native languages from the diaspora, or is it mostly?
I'm no longer in the diaspora right now, but I live in India again. So.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry.
Oh no problem at all. I was in the diaspora. I did spend 8 years in the US and Canada. So, but I mean, you know, I've always been in between. But no, I mean, I'm not very familiar with regional work, with work in India's other languages, because I can't read them. Like I mean, I can read Bengali, but my first language is English. I mean, technically my mother tongue is Bengali, Bangla, and growing up, we spoke both languages at home. But interestingly enough, my brain can't seem to handle two languages at the same time. And so we were taught in English in school, and, you know, I talked with my friends in English. I mean, I think my skills in Bengali just kind of atrophied. And then when I moved to the US and Canada, they atrophied even further. So I'm not fully comfortable in Bengali in the way I am in English. So I wouldn't, you know, I think reading books in Bengali, sadly, is not something I do because my skills are terrible. I've gone back to a toddler's level of reading. So unfortunately, I'm not the person to ask, but I don't think internationally, certainly there isn't genre fiction being written in regional languages in India that's being translated into English, for example, to get them wider exposure. As Anil mentioned, there's plenty of regional writing within a genre space, within a non-realist space. It's tons of it, but I haven't read any of it, so I can't really speak to it. But there's definitely a tradition of it, and as Anil pointed out, especially in Bengal, when I was growing up, I did read several kind of science fiction, horror-ish stories in Bangla. I've forgotten most of the names of the authors, but Satyajit Ray was one of them, the famous director. And he famously also supposedly wrote a script that was the nascent form of E.T. that Spielberg supposedly stole, or whether unwittingly or not. I don't know how accurate that is, but I do remember seeing an illustration he did of, I think, of that story of a boy with an alien. It was quite lovely. He was very, obviously, he was an extremely talented artist and writer in every way, and director. But yeah, there's plenty of non-English writing probably in non-realist modes, but as Anil also mentioned, it's probably not thought of as science fiction, really.
Thanks. Thank you, Indra. I'm going to add also something to your question, Lavanya, on the same vein. Couple of Anil and Indra both mentioned that in an earlier question that the way that science fiction or even spec fiction in general is treated in India, sometimes it's not treated as serious literature in this regard. But whether it is written in the native language or it's written in English, if you identify as a speculative fiction or a science fiction or a fantasy writer, do you think that it has affected you, that people think you're not a serious writer in that regard?
I definitely think so to some extent, you know, because like Anil said earlier, right, science fiction and fantasy are treated as books for children primarily. And it always breaks my heart to walk into a bookstore because most bookstores actually classify them in the children's section. So every time I take a flight in Indian Airport, I will find a ton of fantasy all lumped together with children's books. So I think when you identify as someone who actively wants to create speculative fiction, you are sort of taken less seriously, possibly maybe labeled as not literary enough, right? And that is problematic. Having said that, what ends up happening is the tiny group of readers that we do have in India and South Asia who read science fiction identify with you very strongly. So in that sense, you know, you're possibly foregoing much wider appeal to have people who are really, really interested in your work and who are likely to pick it up because, you know, one, there are so few people identifying as spec fic writers, and two, this tiny group, like I said, while really, really sort of insignificant compared to our overall population, they are very into sci-fi and fantasy. So yeah, but I do think, you know, you kind of step away from being appealing in the mainstream or in literary circles. Yeah.
Do any of you feel that way too, or before I go to Usman with my very specific Usman question?
It's peculiar, actually. I think the reception of an author is it's a complex topic, right? And someone like, say, Amitabh Ghosh can write Calcutta Chromosome and it's treated as serious work, whereas some other work the author might not be. So it's, I think, to a large extent, how the author presents themselves to, and it goes both ways. If there are readers who reject science fiction, there are also writers who kind of reject the larger mainstream world in the books they read, in the conferences they go to, in the authors they contact. So in the publisher they even approach, perhaps. So you find that there's a kind of a self-selecting, self-sorting that happens, where different groups just gather around the things that they're only interested in, right? But others who consciously choose to work in different areas and present themselves that way, I think, do have a certain leeway. There's been a tradition of authors who are very serious, considered very serious authors, serious in the sense of that they are willing to put the effort in. The book might take 5 years, 10 years, or whatever, but they choose to work in different areas. So they'll write a horror story, but they'll also work in something about, say, conditions in a poor village. So I think it's possible. It's still possible. The marketing departments haven't completely taken over yet. But yeah.
Usman?
Yes.
Well, I wanted to ask you what your thoughts on that as well. But I also specifically wanted to ask you what the market is like for spec fic, science fiction, horror, and all the genre fiction is in Pakistan. Whether
So,
it's
I think these guys have pretty much covered most of the issues that plague the Indian subcontinent. I don't think Pakistan is an exception. I would, in fact, say that Pakistan has it a little bit worse in terms of the local publishing scene, because we don't really have a lot of good, reputable publishing houses, maybe 3, 4 that I can count at the top of my head, which is just unfortunate. However, but remember, we're talking about publications in English mostly now. We're not talking about publication in regional languages. So for Urdu and Punjabi or Saraiki, you can go to the Urdu Bazaar, and in an area of 1 square mile, there are 100 publishers. They're just churning out books left and right. And you can self-publish, you can sell it to them, you can make deals. So there's a lot of publishing happening. It's just not happening in English necessarily. So all my answers will be pertinent to English, not really the regional language. So in terms of, Anil's comment about writers, presenting themselves and branding themselves, I think that's really well taken, because someone like Mohsin Hamid, who started off with Moth Smoke, which is a very realist, very serious sort of an MFA sort of a novel. And then he goes on to, from there, he journeys all the way to Exit West, which is about magical portals. It's a portal fantasy. He may not choose to call it that, but it's a portal fantasy. But because of his legacy, the way he's built up, and more importantly, the path through which he's risen, it brands him as a literary writer akin to someone like, I don't know, Cormac McCarthy or, Margaret Atwood maybe. So he comes from that school. But one of the things Carmen Maria Machado recently was talking about was, how often we talk about genre in realism and mainstream. And I think we often forget that genre has a lot of tools to, and tips and tricks and techniques to teach realism, and it's vice versa. And I think often we sort of localize ourselves in these little bubbles, and there's no crossover happening, and that can really not be very productive. So I think for a writer who is happy to work in either, I don't think from a marketing point of view in Pakistan, they're going to be at a disadvantage. I think the readership will be happy to take them. I think that if they are doing like putting 5 years, 2 years, 3 years into a book, and or 6 months, depends on what their comfort level is and writing chops are like, I think they will be received well. The issue is, where do you publish? So where are Pakistani writers going to publish? In the last decade, a lot of Pakistani writers in English have been publishing in India. And so they're using that to kickstart their careers. And again, that speaks to, in our part of the world, I think that really speaks to a peri-colonial mentality, that unless you're recognized internationally by anyone, doesn't matter who, till someone says you are stamped and approved and ready to go, sir or madam, you are not recognized locally. And that is a big problem in Pakistan. And we're now seeing the outcome of that because of recently, in the last 6 months to a year, because of political tension, Indian books are not getting to Pakistan. Pakistani books are not getting to India. And that's completely blocked these writers off. So they have no outlet. Their books are getting published, but they can't sell them in Pakistan, which is a big market for the Indian publishers. As far as I know, I could be wrong there. So that's my.
Does that include short fiction?
Short fiction, I don't know if traditionally we've had a lot of short fiction writers. I mean, I can again count on my fingertips the number of well-recognized, well-known short story writers in English. Daniel Muinuddin is one, but he published internationally again. A very few writers in Pakistan who published locally were able to really develop a legacy. I remember writers from back when I was 10 or 12 years old who published collections from smaller houses. I don't even know if the collections are available now. There was a collection called Hair of the Dog. I remember reading that when I was like 11 or 12. I have never seen that again in any bookstore. I just remember that because it was a gift from a friend and I liked the stories. They were funny.
Well, as far as short fiction is concerned, over the last few decades, with the internet and magazines coming out, there's been internationally at least a lot of venues for people to publish short fiction. And I suppose, I guess just like for Filipino and for Singaporean authors, a lot of genre writers actually tend to publish overseas versus publishing in short fiction venues within their countries or even their regions. I don't know if any of you have heard of in Singapore used to have this publication called Lontar, which is it's a publication that basically showcases short fiction from all of Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, Lontar, which conveniently I actually have here, actually closed its doors a few years back, and since then there's been no outlet for Southeast Asian speculative fiction. How about in India? Do you find what are your thoughts on that? Do you think that people should just continue to publish, Strange Horizons or whatever outlet that they can publish, or should something be done to actually have local publishers or local venues for people to actually publish within their own countries or even regions? I throw the question out to anyone that's there.
I think at the moment there isn't there aren't very many places to publish short fiction in genre in non-realist mode. There's Mithila Review, and that's about it. And Mithila Review has an international scope. It publishes writers outside India as well. The honest truth is it's extremely difficult to keep a magazine running in any genre, but especially in science fiction and fantasy in India. It's it's a hell of a thing. I mean, it really is not easy. If you talk to the people behind Mithila Review, they will tell you that it's it's extremely difficult to keep running to get the money for it, because people within India are not subscribing. It's people outside India who are subscribing. So I don't know if there's enough of cultural infrastructure for that to survive here. I mean, I was briefly involved in kind of tangentially as I was asked to be an editor for a potential magazine in India, and then that fell through as well, because it just, the money wasn't there, and it was just too difficult. and I don't know if the readership is there in for short fiction, especially because science fiction writers are reading magazines abroad, and there's so many of them. There's absolutely hundreds of magazines now, and so it's hard to compete. But also, even without the competition, I just don't think we have that kind of cultural infrastructure for what is ultimately a Western defined notion. Like science fiction and fantasy is a Western genre. It's centered in the West. The public, like everything. I mean, my career exists because of Western publishing, not because of Indian publishing. I started out publishing in American science fiction magazines. That's how I started my career. And then my debut novel was first published in India, but again, it was barely read here. It's much more widely read abroad. So it's hard to tell, really. I mean, where the issues are, what needs to be addressed. But ultimately, unlike other countries which have a more like burgeoning sense of regional science fiction and fantasy that kind of maps onto this Western concept, like say China or several European countries or the UK, they have their own magazines. They have things devoted to science fiction and fantasy. They have grants, etc. Of course, the Chinese model of supporting science fiction is, again, that's that's a very specific thing that is going into an entirely different discussion. And I wouldn't want that for India. I wouldn't want our government to be spearheading some kind of propagandistic science fiction. That would be, I would not want to participate in that. But it would be great if there was some support for the arts in general. This country just it's extremely shabby because we don't have a government that cares about the arts ultimately, except as propaganda. But and just to add, I think it's great that Western publishers are open to international writers. I think that's fantastic. That's how I got into science fiction fantasy. That's how so many writers in India access this genre. And we call it a genre, but it's huge. It's a kind of writing rather than a genre. We're talking about a whole spectrum of fiction that is non-realist. It says, it's such a wonderfully diverse form of writing. It's just basically anything that isn't realist writing. So I think the opportunities that are available abroad are fantastic, and I think people should use them as long as they exist. But it would, of course, be great to have more outlets like that all over the world, including India.
I completely agree with you. And I think the vast majority of us actually have either published overseas or have been published or even started a writing career on Western, in a Western venue somewhere. But it was also mentioned by all of you that unfortunately that kind of helps with reinforce the whole colonial mentality of it all, that if you publish there, that's the only time that you will get accepted in your own home country. It also reinforces the fact that the center of our chosen writing field is overwhelmingly in the West. So, but rather than denying reality or rallying about it, I want to ask each of you, how do you think we can actually decolonize this, or at least how do we move the center a little bit away from where the West is and more towards something that's a little more global in scope, or at least closer to something that isn't what the current state is right now. Lavanya, I actually want to throw that question to you first.
Sure. I think something that's really important when it comes to decolonizing the kind of fiction that we write is the lens through which we write that fiction. And by that, I mean, we have a colonial history, right? Most of the world does. And a lot of the time, I think that there is the existence of a colonial gaze, even when these markets that we're pitching to view our work, right? And there are certain colonial expectations of what the boundaries of possibility are when, let's say, you're a writer writing from India. What does it mean to represent your Indian roots in the realm of speculative fiction, right? I think there are so many diverse experiences that constitute the countries and the regions that we come from. But I feel there are instances in which those are somewhat narrowed down to a very tiny field of vision in terms of what is truly authentic as an Indian voice, for example, right? And what are those markers that qualify us for that authenticity? And I think to truly decolonize, we kind of have to move away from that. And I'm not saying those aren't valid perspectives, simply to give an example. I think Indra was saying earlier, mythological fiction is huge here, right? And it's a very convenient way to view an authentic Indian voice or an experience, because we have such a rich history and so much mythology that presenting this immediately qualifies a certain work as being from this region. Having said that, there are so many interpretations of what this region can be, especially when you look at futurism and when you look at science fiction. And I think to truly decolonize, we need to kind of somewhere push this sort of pluralist viewpoint of what an Indian voice can really be, or what a South Asian or an East Asian voice can really be. What are the stories that we can tell with legitimacy? And that means, to me, moving away from this post-colonial gaze, both in terms of what the markets expect from us, but also in terms of the works that we choose to produce.
Thank you, Lavanya. Usman, what are your thoughts on this?
I agree with Lavanya about moving away from the colonial gaze. So we're still living in Edward Said's Orientalist world, right? I mean, that is what. So Said was very prescient about this nearly 30, 40 years ago, and we're seeing that ripple effect even in genre and in realism now. One of the questions that I'm sure every single person on this panel has been asked is, how do you introduce your regional languages? How do you write them? How do you write words from them in English, in an English story? And how do you navigate that balance? And how could you make sure that the editor is not going to get hey, this is inaccessible, this is dense, can you remove this word, can you use this? And so India, Pakistan, South Asia, we have had the fallout of colonialism, of course, but we've also in a place where we can take advantage of whatever has been given to us as the fallout, because we have to make do, right? We have to move on from that. And I think that means using the music of both languages. You can use the music of English, and you can, Salman Rushdie did that in the Satanic Verses and Midnight's Children. The music of both languages came together in a confluence, at least for me. And I mean, people might, not everyone agrees with that, but I thought that he was able to create that confluence. So using that and, that pluralist music, that pluralist, the richness of two languages, and using them to your advantage and bending it, to wield it as a weapon. I think that is one way to do this. The other thing is, I think every country should have a Mary and Mohan Raj. So we all need more Strange Horizons. We all need more magazines, and every country should have. I mean, not should. I mean, I'm not mandating this, but it would be useful if all these countries had at least one magazine that would be devoted to showcasing these languages and highlighting interesting writers that, for whatever reason, may not find admission in Western science fiction publications. I mean, you know, and I think Anil Menon or Jayaprakash Satyamurthy introduced me to Nayyar Masood's work. And I can't see Nayyar Masood breaking through Asimov's or fantasy magazine of fantasy and science fiction. That ain't happening. But Masood's caliber, I mean, he's a legend. He's a giant, towers over any postmodern Urdu writer, in my opinion. So we would not have discovered Masood had he not been writing in his own language. And then Muhammad Umar Memon and other people translated him.
Thank you for that. That was. I wanted to focus on something that you mentioned earlier, and I wanted to ask everybody about it regarding using, say, native words or native concepts in your writing. And I realized that this probably is an entire panel on its own. But what is your personal thought on italics? Usman, since you started it.
Am I allowed to use someone else's quote in which there's a slur? I think we all know the quote that I'm going to refer to. It's a gentleman who's been canceled 3 years ago, but you know, Juno Diaz said this a few years ago, didn't he? Where he said that what was so we basically said that these readers will memorize you know, the entirety of Tolkien and what's the language? Elvish, right?
Elvish, yeah.
Elvish, and they'll memorize Elvish and they'll read entire books and histories written in Elvish, but introduce a few Spanish words and motherfuckers think we're invading.
Anil, do you feel the same way?
I think it's a non-issue in the sense that it's like a spice, right? If I know that authors, there's a nice paper by, in fact, which talks about this, how authors can actually use this to show that they are in India or in Pakistan, or you throw in words like, you know, the word for saffron, or you have hair braiding going on, then you cannot understand that you're in a domestic situation in a colonized country. There are these cultural markers, and language is one of them. And so authors do use these local words, regional words. They will use, for example, the word panka rather than just say fan, right? Because it brings a certain atmosphere into the story. So I see it as a technique rather than as a political statement or a technical or a problem. You use the language to create atmosphere, use the language to get to where you need to get to. And don't worry too much about the reader, because if you worry too much about the reader, then you lose them. And I think they will follow you. If you're confident about what you're doing, then they'll follow you. So that's the operating assumption anyway. And if you worry about whether I should italicize chapati, because there is some reader out there who's so sensitive that they will not bother to look up this word, or they get thrown and say, I can't read further because what does chapati mean? You know, then that's not a reader you need to be writing for. You just go on. When you read French words, when you read Spanish words, that doesn't stop you. So I am assuming that there are other readers exactly like me, and they will read what I put out there, assuming that I think they'll assume that is necessary for the story. It's necessary for the atmosphere, necessary for whatever the reason that I put it in there for. I don't think it's a problem. I think we tend to make it a problem, but I don't think it's a problem. So go ahead and use whatever words you need to use. To the point of not writing in the regional language, of course. I mean, ultimately, it's an English story. So,
Lavanya, did you get into that issue when you wrote your debut novel?
Not really. I think you know, further to what Anil was saying, it really depends on context. I think I'm okay italicizing if I have to say lay emphasis on a word, but I'm not going to go out of my way to do it to necessarily emphasize its foreignness. I might do it to emphasize it when it's used in speech, but that's about it. And I'm very unworried about using words from different languages. I grew up in Bangalore and we speak Kannada here, but I'm of Tamil origins. So I have all these languages in my head at different points. And as and when I want to, I will just throw a word in there that has its place there, but not go overboard with its usage either.
Indra, I have a slightly different question for you. You like to write about far future, at least in the stories that I like that you do. To what extent can you still do this and include things that are markers of your culture when actually by that time that you're writing, any word that you come up will probably be a new word anyway? How can you still make it sound like it's an Indian thing, or when literally, if you're setting it like Star Trek is going to the 32nd century, it doesn't matter what word you put, it's going to be exotic in some way.
I will get to that, but just to address the earlier question, I will say that I never had any problem with editors demanding italicization. I mean, of foreign words. Whenever I've like with my novel, there's a lot of words in various languages throughout the book, and they're not italicized because I asked them, if it was okay if they weren't italicized, and he said, yeah, it's fine. And it's the same with stories. I think nowadays editors pretty much are, at least in genre fiction, are pretty used to the notion of not italicizing foreign words. I don't think it's that much of an issue anymore. But I'm sure that style still persists in literary fiction and realism. I do remember reading an article once. I wish I could remember, but it was a writer, I think an East Asian writer, who was arguing that in some cases that we shouldn't do these blanket generalizations of concepts like this, because she was arguing that in some languages it's helpful to have italicized versions of the foreign words because they might be read in a different way than in English than they would be in that language. So anyway, but I think again context matters. But to get to your secondary question, how do I retain elements of Indian culture? I mean, I'm not too concerned with that, honestly, because often my stories are set, as you were saying, in so far a future. I wanted to feel alien. I wanted to feel like exploring an entirely new culture. But when it comes to making new words in new languages, that's a very difficult thing to do, because no matter what you do, it ends up sounding stupid at first, thinking I'm just making up nonsense and this is silly. But I tend to join words of different cultures, different languages. I look them up, and so I'll go by the notion that various languages have kind of converged and mutated together, as happens with real languages. So I'll usually use an Indian language combined with, say, Japanese or Chinese or Mandarin or any various languages that I look up, and it's very easy to mess up languages you don't know because there's a ton of context again. But when you're making up entirely new words, it's a lot easier because then you can bury all the languages into a new one. So that's how I usually kind of retain a slight sense of South Asianness by incorporating South Asian languages into these new languages.
Thank you. I have a question that comes from the audience. Now, let me just rephrase it a bit. Can you tell me, in your opinion or from your point of view, if the science fiction or speculative fiction that you see from where you are falls more in the dystopian side of things or in the solar punk more positive side of things? At least where from your perspective of Indian or Pakistani science fiction. This time, let's start with Usman because.
Well, I wonder if I don't know how much more dystopia we can really take. I think we've had a couple of 3 or 4 decades of dystopia. We've lived in dystopia, and we're children of dystopia at this point. So I'm not sure that I think any writer should write whatever they want to write and whatever speaks to them and how to go about it. But I would argue a lot of our realist literature is really very grimdark and very dystopian by dint of what they're really handling the issues. one of the things that I have wanted to do, and I think Neil Stephenson did that with the Center for Science and Imagination at Arizona State back in 2012, where Neil invited a bunch of writers to write stories that were utopian. And the challenge was that we've had enough of dystopia. Let's reimagine better futures. And it was called, the anthology was called Hieroglyphs, I think. I think Vandana Singh had a story in it. I'm not sure if, Anil, did you have a story in that too?
No, I did.
You did.
Yeah, Vandana Singh had I didn't.
You did.
Vandana Singh had a story. Yeah.
Yes, Vandana had a story in that, and it's a really good anthology. It's a really successful anthology, and I think that it's not a bad idea to kind of think about that when people are sitting down, because this. I would also say that we have so much precedent in writing dystopian fiction that after a while it sort of starts becoming a little cliched when people start using the same template over and over again. So I think that a lot of writers that I know are really striving consciously to imagine better futures, imagine pluralistic, solidified futures and better solutions. And I think science fiction, in my opinion, is pretty good at doing that, at giving people ideas of better alternate futures.
Cool. Anil?
Yeah, I think what I've always found, the danger with taking either a utopian or a dystopian stance in your writing, is that it becomes propaganda. Your personal views of the future begin to affect every character, every situation. And you will have people who take your side and people who don't take your side in the story. And I think it's a dangerous thing for a writer to say, I'm going to write a utopian novel, or I'm going to write a dystopian novel, because you're basically not doing your story any favors. You're basically saying that your story is going to be a kind of a propaganda piece that's going to push your point of view onto the world. So I've always never been fond of either dystopias or utopias. I'd much rather prefer in which you have a wide spectrum of characters and they have different views of how the future is going to be, and let them hash it out. And whether overall the novel or the story gives a sense of being a dystopia is really up to the reader. It's up to the reader's mind to complete the story, and they say, oh, this is a grim story, or this is an unhappy story. I find that if you let your characters take different positions and you argue for each one of them as if they are your own, you'll get a far more interesting story than saying that, oh, capitalism is going to ruin the world, so let's now write a story in which we show the evil effects of capitalism and what it does to people. You're essentially writing a propaganda piece, and I think it harms the story in the long run. You should have a capitalist who passionately believes in capitalism. You should have a person who doesn't, and let them hash it out in the story. And the reader can decide at the end of the day what flavor of the future they tasted. So I think that's the sensible way to go about it. That said, I of course have enjoyed utopias and dystopias like Brave New World and 1984, and I've been influenced by them too. I just think it's a dangerous road for a writer to set off saying that I will produce such a work. So that's where I stand.
Yeah. Very good point, Anil. Indra, what are your thoughts on this?
To answer the person's question, I don't think we can really generalize about the output coming from South Asia, whether it's primarily dystopian or utopian, because it's quite diverse, and probably neither, as most people don't fall into either category. As Anil was saying, most stories are somewhere in between when they're set in the future, because that's realistically it's dystopia. We live in a dystopia, but the focus of a fiction is usually somewhere in between. When you've got full-on utopias, they tend to be further in the future, like Star Trek, but even with Star Trek, their most interesting show is arguably the one that explores the ways in which their utopia fails, which is Deep Space Nine, where they really kind of explore the latent imperialism of Starfleet and etc. And they do it in a really interesting way. But yeah, just to go off what's already been discussed, I think ultimately these are marketing categories, dystopian and utopian. Books, fiction, I don't think is usually either. There are examples, and dystopian fiction globally, it tends to refer to a very specific thing, which is a trend that's already kind of dying out. The wide dystopian craze, which is characterized by the Hunger Games, etc. There was like a billion different imitations of that, and now that's kind of worn itself out. And now, yeah, we'll probably get a whole bunch of dark futures again because of the state of the world. And it's only realistic that people are going to address that. How can you not? We're on a incredibly destructive path, and so I think fiction should deal with that, absolutely, and also imagine ways to overcome it. Certainly, I think Vandana's fiction, people have mentioned it, and it's a great example of she writes both dark and very positive scenarios, but they're never flat, they're never simplistic. They're about the characters that are dealing with the world, and not just about look how amazing this future is. And one of the most interesting novels out of South Asia, science fiction novels out of South Asia recently, Samit Basu's Chosen Spirits. He often calls it a best case scenario and says it's not a dystopia because it's a positive outcome looking at the state of India in the present. But if you were just to take it as a work of fiction, it would be very dark. It's a very dark future, but not in a way that is oppressively grimdark. It's also very witty, it's funny, it's smart, and it focuses on daily life in a way that a lot of fiction that tries to play up a dystopia or a utopia doesn't often get into the cultural nitty-gritty of those worlds and what it means to live in those worlds. And I think Chosen Spirits does that very well, just charting the everyday lives of people who are essentially powerless, except in very specific privileged circles. And that was very interesting to me.
Thank you. Thank you, Indra. Lavanya?
Like Indra said, I think labels like dystopia and utopia are just that, right? They're labels. When you're actually looking at a work of science fiction or fantasy, yes, there is a system, and it's often an imagined future or a reimagined past. But what these stories are really about are the people in those futures or pasts, right? And their relationship, possibly with the system, definitely with each other, how that system sort of impacts their worldviews, their sort of perspective and ambitions and desires. And I really think at the heart of it, these labels are just marketing tactics. They're an easy way to say, hey, if you really like, like with my book, people said, if you really like Black Mirror, you're going to like this book. And I thought, well, I was actually being quite satirical when I wrote this book, and but it eventually ended up being labeled. And all right, so for what it's worth, it's been labeled. But really, to me, the magic of speculative fiction and what we do is alienating people from everything that's familiar and giving them an alternate reality to exist in, but really trying to get to the heart of what makes them human or not. And I think that's what we're doing. We're actually just building worlds. And once that world is built and this text goes out there to your reader, then it exists in the reader's imagination or in a marketing team's imagination. And at that point, feel free to label, but I don't think we as writers can truly label works as a dystopian or utopian.
Thank you, Lavanya. Something that Usman said actually struck me just now. We are living in several layers of dystopia right now. And one of the interesting things we have a global audience and they may not be so familiar with works from your part of the world. And I guess some people are curious, is there actually an upbeat or utopian or however close that you can get it story or novel or work that you can recommend from your part of the world?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
It's called Bollywood.
I would say Bollywood is deeply dystopian.
But jolly, but jolly.
Which makes it even more frightening.
Yeah.
There is a YouTube channel that collects some of the most.
Yeah, so just in terms of recommendations, I think Vandana Singh's Ambiguity Machines is an excellent example of, I mean, I wouldn't say it's upbeat exactly, but it's got a lot of optimism, and and it's there's a lot of stories that are positive, in a way. But it's just generally speaking, it's an excellent work of science fiction, which isn't very dour and pessimistic, generally speaking.
We actually have less than 30 minutes left. We've actually gone through most of the questions that are here. There is another question that just came right now. Can you give some good examples of magazines focused in science fiction or speculative fictions? Or can you name any new authors in India, Pakistan, the Philippines? That's a kind of like a very big question over there. Anil, maybe you'd like to take a stab at this?
I'm very bad at pulling off names off the top of my head. But I mean, like, I don't think they're new authors as so much as authors who've been working in it for a while, like Samit Basu's Chosen Spirits, for example. So the thing is, I don't go, and Lavanya's work, for example, that's recently come out. And you find works in which they come in magazines, international magazines typically, rather than magazines that are in the subcontinent. Mithila Review had specials on, I think, fiction from the subcontinent a year or so ago. And that had many samples of writers who are working here. So it's kind of spread out, and most of the names are familiar to those who work in the field. And there is this, so I, for example, I do this workshop with Pervin Saket every year, Pervin and Akshat Nigam actually. And like Usman, we take about 13 to 14 writers, and some of them go on to write stories that are basically spec-fic stories. But they don't see themselves as that. They don't see themselves that way. They're also writing other stuff. So they'll be publishing in magazines that don't necessarily cater to spec-fic, or they don't think that they're catering to spec-fic. So the authors are not labeling themselves that strongly as spec-fic writers. In that sense, it's a little difficult to say that read this author, right? Because you'll find one story is spec-fic, another story is not. So I don't know. Maybe Indra can.
Just as Anil said, there aren't really very many Anglophone SFL magazines here. There's Mithila Review. That's you could always go to that. But yeah, there's names. There's several. Recently, there's 3 writers who were nominated for the Nebula or the Hugo: Shiv Ramdas, Mimi Mondol, and Nivedita Sen. There's Vikram Paralkar, there's Tashan Mehta, Samit Basu, as was mentioned, Jay Prakash Satyamurthy, S.B. Divya.
S.B. Divya, yeah.
Everyone on this panel. So it's, and I think Mithila is a good place to look because they do showcase a lot of international writers.
This Tarun Sain's anthology. I think there are 2 anthologies by Tarun Sain.
And the Magical Women anthology as well.
Magical anthology, yeah.
Lavanya?
Yeah, I mean, this is a great list of writers to begin with. There's Gautam Bhatia's The Wall, which I just read. Beautiful book. There's Yudhanjaya Vijayaratne from Sri Lanka, who was also Nebula nominated, I think the same year as Divya, as S.P. Divya. Vandana Singh, whom we spoke about, Manjula Padmanabhan as well. And I think another book by, I think Varun Thomas Matthew had a book called The Black Dwarfs of Good Little Bay. Quite enjoyed that as well. So, you know, there's a breadth of writing that could be considered speculative.
I just remembered Saad Hussain as well from Bangladesh, writing some amazing books. And Vajra Chandrasekhar from Sri Lanka.
And Apupen, who works in graphic novels.
Right.
His Halhala series. So he's there.
Did we mention Jayaprakash Satyamurthy as well?
I think
Yeah, we did, right? Yeah.
I forgot the name of the author of Savage Blue. It's another specific work. I don't know if you guys have read it.
I haven't read it, but I have I've had it recommended.
Krishna, I think. Yeah.
There is an Indian spec fic writer who used to live in Singapore, returned to India. Christina Undasakera.
Oh, Krishna.
Krishna.
Yeah, of course, Krishna. Yeah. Krishna as well. Yes.
Yeah, I met her at the festival last year before she moved back.
Yeah.
I have I'm actually, oh, by the way, Indra, you mentioned Deep Space Nine. That's actually what I'm wearing, the uniform. Of
Nice. Yeah. I'm actually not very much of an expert on Deep Space Nine at all. I just started watching it like a few months ago, but
it is my favorite. Yeah, actually,
it's wonderful,
by chance, I'm actually seated at my work desk. So
All right.
within hand, couple of anthologies that I have. This one, the best of Asian speculative, actually contains a lot of both South Asian and Southeast Asian speculative fiction. That's here.
Yeah.
The one I mentioned earlier that I showed, Lontar, is actually, although focused primarily on Southeast Asia, has a lot of people of South Asian descent that are actually in here. Sadly, Lontar only had 10 volumes before it ended. I have a couple of stuff here. I don't know. They're mostly Southeast Asian. For Singapore, there's two. You have this collection, Fish Eats Lion, and this
book.
The Moon. Yeah, these are anthologies here.
Yeah.
Philippines has this the Philippine speculative fiction, which is probably the oldest Philippine anthology that's out there. Malaysia has a very funky cover. This is Cyberpunk Malaysia, one of the few Malaysian anthologies. I don't know if I'm showing it to you the right way. If I flash the cover on the camera, it's just blank, so it's weird. So the back cover is better. So these are some works. I hope the person who asked that question is able to find. These posts are in Amazon, I believe. Mitala Review is online. So it is these are ones that they can check out. We have 15 minutes left, and I want to to give this time to all of you to give any announcements or anything that you want to, some last minute thoughts. Anil?
Oh,
Launches, announcements, anything you want to say to the audience?
Yeah. So I have a collection of short stories coming out this year or early next year, and these are spec-fic stories. So that's coming out from Hatchet. So I'm looking forward to that. And there's another collection that I'm peddling. So it's some justification for living after all these years. I can point to the collection. We're not decided on the title yet, so I can't give the name of it. But all the stories revolve around the idea of quintessence, the idea that things have an essence in them that makes them what they are and not something else. The stories are about that. So yeah. I always tell people not. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm looking forward to see that book when it comes out. Yeah.
Thank you, Victor. Yeah.
Hopefully we'll be able to get it from here in Singapore.
Yeah.
Indra?
I have a couple of stories coming out. It's actually not announced yet, so I can't talk about it. But I do have another science fiction story, and interestingly, it's a kind of positive one because it's in the MIT Press anthology. 12 Tomorrows, which then the next year's volume will be called Makeshift, and it's kind of about imagining post-pandemic futures. So there is a lot of darkness in it, but it's generally about recovery and about living through catastrophe, and it's a mecha story, set in
Mecha story.
Mecca, yeah, set in Kolkata again, very like after this entire age of plagues, kind of well, still in that age, but in a different kind of phase of this whole era. So yeah, I'm very proud of that story. So hopefully people get to read it. I don't know how accessible that volume will be internationally, but we'll see. And yeah, there's a couple other stories that I have due, but that's far in the future. And of course, I'll try and write more books.
I want to read that mecha story of yours. I'm a very big fan of mecha. Underneath my Star Trek shirt, I have a mecha shirt. See?
Nice.
What's underneath that, Victor?
You're just waiting for us to mention these things, yeah.
Lavanya, what about you? You had a book out recently.
Yes. I have a couple of stories coming out soon, but again, those haven't been announced, so I really can't go into them. But I did have a book that launched, I think, 2 weeks before India went into complete lockdown. So, you know, but this is the book. I do have a copy here. It's called Analog Virtual, and it's set in the future of Bangalore, India. And it's a collection of interconnected shorts that sort of weaves its way through the future of Bangalore. Bangalore is run by a corporation, and it's actually quite, you know, they believe it's positively utopian. It's just that the characters who live in this space, you know, they have some issues with the sort of way the system has been set up. So yeah, it's a collection of shorts. If you want, you can pick it up I think in India, wherever books are sold, and internationally, it's available on Amazon. So yeah.
I want to read that book. When I was reading the blurb for it, I was struck by how it seemed like Singapore to me.
there are strains of Singapore there. Yes, there are some, I think. Yeah.
Usman?
Yeah. So, you know, before I go on to make an announcement, I did want to touch a little bit about writers to watch out for on the Pakistan side of things. So, you know, the Salam Award every year chooses about 3 to 10 writers as their honorable mentions, finalists, and winner. So some of the writers that have come to our notice include Kehkashan Khalid. She won the Salam Award last year for a very, very good story that's available online. It's at the Salam Award website. Firoza Pastakia wrote a remarkable story a few years ago. I don't know if it was when Anil was jury. I can't remember. But Firoza
that was practically a novella.
That was Akbar Shahzad.
Yeah, I love that story too. Yeah.
Akbar did an excerpt from, it was a really long piece.
Yeah.
Firoza Pastakia was our first year winner, remarkable writer, remarkable story. So Firoza Pastakia, she tends to be a little low profile in general. So, and she really hasn't done any panels or stuff. We really should have. So Kehkashan Khalid, Akbar Shahzad, Firoza Pastakia, Noor Nasreen Ibrahim, who actually was on the Patriot Act with Hassan Minhaj some time ago. There was a Dawn article about her. And in terms of other writers, there's Sarah Khan, who just had a book come out in India, actually, 6 months ago. So she's someone to maybe look up. And I think that's pretty much it that's all the people I can remember right now.
I was wondering, is there anything like an anthology of these works that people outside Pakistan would be able to read or purchase? That would be something that's of interest, I think, to a lot of people.
Yeah, so, you know, Noor Nasreen had a story in the Golan's book of South Asian science fiction, And now Kehkashan and I and another writer have stories in the volume 2 of Tarun Sen's Dolan's book. So they can access some of the stories there. But as far as an anthology goes, I promise it is in the works at some point. It is in the works.
Very nice.
That would be great. And I personally would like to read it.
As far as my own announcement goes, I just have a book that's coming out in February 2021 from Kitab Publishers in Pakistan. It was a deliberate choice to publish locally because I wanted to really tap into. So the book is basically a collection of 7 stories. It has my Bram Stoker award-winning story. It has another story that was up for the Stoker and the Nebula. What we did was we reached out to 7 Pakistani artists who like specfic, and we commissioned illustrations for each story. So it's kind of like a mini tiny coffee table sort of thing.
Oh,
it's
that's amazing.
hopefully
Yeah.
gonna
Beautiful.
be really I'm hoping it's going to be really pretty. So we have a total of 9 artists involved: cover artist, design, and then 7 artists who did illustrations, and all illustrations in my hand now. And they are really, really something. So I'm excited about sending the book out there in the next few weeks.
So for the benefit of us who are not in South Asia, will we be able to buy that book?
Yeah, so happily I was able to set up my publisher Kitab and I, we talked about that, and we were able to set up a PayPal account. So anyway, the book is going to ship anywhere in the world. And actually for the small, tiny press, like, that we have in Pakistan, the pre-orders already exceeded 100 copies. So I'm really excited about that. It was a limited run, so we've already exceeded about 150 orders. So interestingly, no one in Pakistan cares about me. 90% of the pre-orders are from the US and Canada and England.
Congratulations, though. That's went up. If there's any
It's a great book. It's really good.
Pre-order slot. Well, we actually only have about 5 minutes left, unfortunately, and I'm obligated to say some procedural things before we go. So let's say we have to say goodbye to our audience, and thank you to everyone on the panel. You've all been great, and I think if this wasn't a conference, we could probably end up talking the rest of the night with the right with the right food and drink all around. I have to. We actually have to. I want to thank the FutureCon organizers for inviting all of us to this panel and setting this all up and recording. You can actually go to the website futureconsf.com and look at all the other schedules. Please also subscribe to the YouTube channel where you can watch all of us again if you missed this or you want to review anything that was said. And please join the conversation in Discord as well. All the links are there on the website, so please feel free to just sign up. Again, Anil, Usman, Lavanya, and Indra, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you, Victor.
Thank you, Victor.
About 1 more minute before everything ends.
Thank you to the whole team, the FutureCon team.
Wonderful to see you guys again.
Doing all this work. Yeah.
All right. So the question is, I think that's the end. So I don't know what to do. We're the first panel. So.
Do we hang up? Do we?
We just hang out waiting for them to cut our feeds. Yes.
Supposed to be less than a minute left. So
it's okay with everyone. I might exit. I have clinic in about 10 minutes. So
all right.
So
okay.
You've given us the start. Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
I guess we'll all exit one by one now.
Yeah.
Actually,
it was great. It was great talking to you all.
Lovely talking to all of you.
So much again. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Victor.
Bye.